Chapter 3: Egypt, the Rise and Fall of Black Civilization. We may now review and sum up this long period, beginning with an outline of some important developments that highlight factors in the rise and fall of the blacks, and a further discussion of those factors. Let us therefore begin at the beginning, where some of the misinterpretations were simply due to ignorance. This takes us back to the pre-dynastic period of about 4500 BC, certainly not the beginning, but quite far enough. Many writers refer to the kingless periods before centralized states as the rule of nobles, oligarchies, or hierarchies, etc. From the beginning, therefore, the Westerners applied Western concept to quite different African institutions. Later they described the same kind of societies as chiefless, or worse, stateless. They did not understand the African constitutional system of real self-government by the people through their representatives, the Council of Elders. Nor did they seem to understand that the chief elder or chief was also the chief priest, or that the other elders also have religious functions in connection with their respective clans. During the pre-dynastic period under discussion, they were neither oligarchies nor hierarchies, as these terms are understood in the West. In fact, the Western conception of kingship itself was foreign to traditional Africa. What the West called king was in Africa the same senior elder who presided at the Council of Elders had to be elected, and only then if he had the honor of belonging to a family the ancestors of which either founded the state or was the most outstanding in promoting the welfare of the whole people. To such a family, the Africans gave permanent leadership status as long as descendant candidates qualified for it. Westerners call this the royal family. But again, the royal family concept was unknown to traditional Africa, where the chief or king was the chief representative of the people before God and man, and at once the personifications of the people's dignity and the instrument for carrying out their will. Much confusion and trouble developed and still exist all over the continent because Africans generally accepted Western and Asian expressions without accepting their underlying ideas. Hence, an African king who attempted to be an absolute monarch or oriental dictator generally found himself in trouble rather quickly. The blackout in review. The conversion of names in Egypt was on such a universal scale that its African origin and character were changed as much as it was humanly possible to do. Small political units or states, which Europeans style as chiefdoms in other parts of Africa, become nomarchies in Egypt. Since Asians and some Europeans were heavily concentrated in Lower Egypt, it became relatively easy for them to appropriate exclusively for themselves not only the name Egyptian, but also all achievements by the blacks in Upper Egypt and the rest of the Ethiopian Empire. Holding the seacoast and thus blocking African contact with the rest of the world, these white Egyptians were able to perpetuate the myth so successfully that even today many remarkable achievements by blacks elsewhere over the continent are attributed to Egyptian influence. There is something amusing here too, for when they refer to Egyptian influence on African institutions, they are in fact pointing out black influence on black institutions throughout Africa. No one but a fool would deny Asian and European influence in Egypt and elsewhere in Africa. This is a fact that is obvious, but not more obvious than the nature of that influence as it was discussed in part before. It can be singled out and separated from the basic institutions of the blacks as easily as we can separate Islam and Christianity from the traditional African religion. Another pre-dynastic situation to keep in mind concerns government in the two lands. All Asians had their kings in Lower Egypt, and the blacks had their kings in Upper Egypt. The long drawn-out wars between the two races were over the unification and control over the two lands. These struggles apparently had been going on since the Asian incursions began in prehistoric times, and it was not just the control of all Egypt to the first cataract that was involved, but unification and rule of the whole Ethiopian empire from the Mediterranean Sea to the very source of the Nile. This great design and all-consuming objective throughout the history of Africa must be understood if, for example, one is to understand why even black pharaohs of Egypt carried the wars into the heartland of their own race, trying to subdue a rebellious Nubia, Wawat, or Kush. Southern separatist movements and rebellion spread as Asian influence and integration spread in the north. Viewing the outcome from the long perspective of history, Menes' great victory over the Asians, the union of the white and black lands, and the subsequent policy of trying to promote brotherhood through integration, all this turned out to be not a victory for the blacks, but the beginning of their ultimate downfall and almost permanent degradation as a people. It has been pointed out that up to the time of Menes' victory over them, the Asians were rather firmly held behind a borderline along the 29th parallel. Few were allowed in the all-black regions of Upper Egypt. With unification, the situation radically changed in that the gates to the south were now open to the people who already held a fourth of the country. The black masses were therefore apprehensive about the new unification policies, and the general hostility to the Asians checked any immediate and widespread infiltrations southward. But time was on the side of the whites, whose most commendable attributes are tactful persistence when overt aggressive action is for the moment inexpedient, and their careful planning for their future generations with what appears to be more interest in the future welfare of their descendants than they are in the living. In Lower Egypt, they could buy their time and overcome the triumphant blacks in many ways. Asian kings in Lower Egypt, now dethroned, still had a direct power over the blacks through the new brotherhood of integration and amalgamation. The African matrilineal system made the Asian route to the African throne easy when compared with the generally patrilineal system of the whites. All the Asian kings had to do, whether in Lower Egypt or on the Asian continent, was to promote the marriage of royal males to the oldest sisters of African kings. The firstborn male in such a marriage, though Afro-Asian, would be the #1 candidate for the throne. The other event to be awaited with patience was the passing of so many great African leaders and the coming of weaker ones. This was an historic certainty unless cycles of past developments were to be no more. But time seemed slower and longer during the first 5 dynasties, each of which was characterized by great leaders, a period of 755 years. The roll call brings forth names that still resound through the corridors of time. Menes, Athothis, Peribsen, Kaskem, Imhotep, Zoser, Seneferu, Khufu, Khafre, Userkaf, Neferfre, and others who re-established Ethiopian power, a united empire, and held it without a serious challenge for almost 1,000 years. During this period, active foreign trade and expanded contacts with other countries were now possible. Internal stability was achieved through the process of increased centralization of power at Memphis and the perfection of the bureaucracy of the vast imperial administration. The state became the chief promoter and inspirer of progress on all fronts: agriculture, industrial development, science, the arts, engineering, massive building programs, mining, and shipbuilding. The rapid rise and expansion of numerous crafts, each an organized secret society, stimulated the remarkable industrial and building developments. Internal peace and stability provided the opportunity for the outpouring of much hitherto dormant native genius, and religion was the chief motivating source. Every craft society had its own patron sub-god, not to be confused with the supreme god. It was during this same period that stone was first used in building. Hieroglyphic writing was first invented. The great pyramids were built, stone quarrying perfected and expanded, and Imhotep became the world's greatest architect and the father of scientific medicine. It was 7.5 centuries of the most glorious pages in the history of the black world. There was a concentration of some of the greatest leaders in the 4th dynasty, 2613 to 2494 BC. Thereafter, fewer and fewer of the great kings appeared to stem the disorganization that was clearly developing near the close of the 6th dynasty. The most notable achievement was doubtless the compilation of the Palermo Stone Annals, a work of great historical importance. The Old Kingdom ended with this dynasty. The great wealth of the nation continued. International commerce and internal progress overshadowed the accelerating disintegration in the country. Conflicts between the religious cults battling for more and more political power expanded. Rebellions of various chiefdoms seeking independence from weak and weaker rulers at Memphis also spread. Decentralization became the order of the day for which the Asians had been patiently waiting so long. Under weak rulers at Memphis and the breaking up of the country into small independent areas, nomarchies, Asian penetration and expansion in the black land became the normal scene. Earlier, I referred to the African failure to employ the essentials of real nation building and proposed certain criteria they generally fail to use. When this is done, our black students often protest that the same is also true of many non-African peoples. They would like to take comfort in this fact, for it is a fact, and forget the whole thing. But I am not now dealing with these other peoples. I am concerned here only with African life and history. The failures of one people should serve as a warning of what to avoid, and not as a justification for similar failures by another. The glaring weakness in the unification of the Ethiopian Empire was the absence of any national program for the development of a national solidarity and a sense of national community and belonging that aimed at overcoming the greater local or tribal loyalties. To begin with, there were too many tributary states within the empire. Their very reason for being a part of the empire was mainly tribute, their regular contributions to the imperial treasury. Such states did not, and indeed could not, feel themselves to be integral parts of the empire. Blinded by the wealth that was pouring into the national treasury, the empire builders were unable to see or understand the requirements of the human heart and spirit for the formation of attitudes of love and devotion toward a national citizenship. We shall be discussing the traditional African constitution later, because every expanding African kingdom and empire already had the guidelines to both greatness and permanence, but guidelines which the leaders either thought applied only to small states or felt themselves to be so rich and powerful that the traditional constitutional safeguards could be safely ignored. In the smaller states or tribal societies, the African constitutional system operated to promote equal justice, individual and group welfare or social security, and an undying loyalty to the group. The very scheme of social organization assured all this. Group solidarity became a natural development. An almost fierce spirit of brotherhood prevailed in all tribal states. The work of expanding this spirit as the nation expanded was rarely undertaken. Since there was no such program in the best of times, the every province for itself spirit was chaff before the storms of invasions. The invaders had found it easy to establish another Asian capital, even at Heracleopolis. This move, in view of the general trend throughout Ethiopia, was thought to be taken at the most propitious time, the time when the empire was falling apart and no one was in command. But Asian assumption of imperial power and the establishment of their capital in the center of the black world aroused the disorganized and leaderless people to fury. And the Asians apparently had not taken Thebes into account. Thebes, the seat of the blacks' war god and the place from which the mightiest African armies always came. Of course, even with this knowledge, neither the Asians nor anyone else would expect any threat from Thebes in the present state of national chaos. But the blacks had always looked to Thebes in times of crisis, leaders or no leaders. They did so now. Theban leaders emerged, and with them fighting men arose to battle the Asians again. Heracleopolis fell to the blacks, but Asian kings were able to hold Lower Egypt again and re-establish dynasties there under Keti I and his successors. Western historians refer to this period as the First Intermediate Period, 2181 to 2040 BC, and further confuse an already too confused situation by mixing the Asian rulers of Lower Egypt with the African rulers of Upper Egypt, and then listing all the dynasties sequentially, so that from such an arrangement one cannot distinguish the white Asian dynasties, kings, or pharaohs from the black. So the 11 Asian kings of Lower Egypt that followed Keti I appear as kings of Egypt. We should pause at the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, 2133 BC, because during the long 1500 years covered by my brief summary, one of the most unusual socio-political phenomena occurred. It has been referred to numerous times before in terms of its development, but now the unexpected has happened. At this point, we have passed 15 centuries of African-Asian amalgamation, at first largely in Lower Egypt, but afterward more and more in Black Upper Egypt. The Afro-Asian offsprings were called the new breed, the distinguishing characteristics of which were devotion to Asians and hatred of Africans. Unless this point is grasped, we may as well drop the study of African history insofar as understanding fully the internal troubles of this race. Firstly, the Afro-Asians, or coloreds, had far outnumbered the Asians in the northern population during the past 1500 years. Secondly, the coloreds had become sensitively aware that they were suspended between two worlds, the black and the white, and that they were not fully accepted in either. Nowhere did their Asian fathers and other white kinsmen regard or accept them as equals, while the blacks had come to hate them as much as they hated the blacks. Thirdly, out of this situation developed a passionate and defiant Egyptian nationalism that restricted the term Egyptian to mulattoes alone. Henceforth, neither Asians nor Africans were to be called Egyptians. Indeed, the new breed began to treat Asians as strangers and no longer welcomed them en masse, even in Lower Egypt. The Afro-Asians had apparently resolved that since they could not belong to either the black or white race, they would be a race by themselves, and in their own right, the Egyptian race. It worked. Asians, if unmixed, were now called Asians, and Africans, if unmixed, were called Africans or Ethiopians. They alone, the new breed, were to be called Egyptians, and the writers of the world followed this classification from Homer's time to this day. I shall use the terms in the same way in all subsequent references. In the earliest period, Egyptian would have meant the blacks. Later on, it would have meant blacks and Afro-Asians. The white Asians were never called Egyptians, even when they ruled all Egypt. Even the present-day rulers of the land are unhappy with the term and much prefer to be called what they are, Arabs. Hence, the change of the official name of the country from Egypt to the United Arab Republic. However, the increasing hostility to the Asians was due to their offspring's resentment over being rejected as equals and having a lower status in the society whenever white Asians were in control. Their hostility to the Africans had been nurtured from birth and remained the same. Yet they never failed to seek alliances with the blacks when it suited their purposes, just as they do today through OAU, or to marry into ruling African families to enhance and perpetuate their rule. The 11th dynasty was started with stronger black rulers, beginning with Mentuhotep and followed by 3 kings of the same name. Their rule was again limited to Upper Egypt, since the Asians had re-established their rule in Lower Egypt. During the period of nationwide turmoil and rebellions, Mentuhotep II, after restoring order in Upper Egypt and promoting a rapid economic program, had turned north to repeat Menes' great feat of conquering Lower Egypt again. Ethiopia South. But Ethiopia, below the first cataract, did not return to the reunited imperial fold in the north. As we have seen, the southern kingdoms did not intend to return. Their defections had been going on one after another long before the general disorganization and rebellions during the 6th and 7th dynasties. Hostility to the Asian invasions was always greatest in the southern regions. Many of the people claimed the Asian-held areas as their ancestral home. They wanted Lower Egypt conquered and the Asians driven out. Menes had achieved the great victory, but the integration policies that followed were regarded as a betrayal of the blacks. They had lost faith in the black kings ruling from Memphis, who not only favored integration but promoted it. The steady movement of the whites from the Delta into Upper Egypt itself was proof enough for southern blacks that the Asian aim was nothing less than ultimate control of all Ethiopia. So, as the Asian presence and influence spread in Upper Egypt, the withdrawal of the southern kingdoms appeared to keep pace. But why were the blacks farthest away from the Asian threat so much more concerned, or appeared to be, than those who still lived next door to the enemy in Upper Egypt? Even the larger number of refugees from Lower Egypt must have settled in Upper Egypt because the biggest concentration of blacks was there. This would have been the situation around 2400 BC. The answer may be that since Napata was regarded as the unchanging capital and center of the black world, and not Norway, Thebes, of glorious memory, any threat to this sacred area, land of the gods, was a threat to the survival of the race itself. The first great southern division of the Ethiopian Empire was the kingdom of Wawat, and below that was the far greater kingdom of Nubia, which, like many other vast areas, while nominally a part of the empire, was at various times independent. The age-old dream of all the great kings, whether black, white, or mixed, was the consolidation of the northern and southern regions. Hence, the constant wars against Lower Egypt and, now again, Mentuhotep's war against Nubia. In both cases, that of the Asians in the far north and the blacks in the far south, economics was the driving force. The hold on the sea coast not only blocked the Africans from world trade, but that fact enabled the Asians and colors to control the domestic economy indirectly as well. The record shows that every time this Asian stranglehold was broken, African foreign trade flourished again and national prosperity began to rise. On the other hand, southern Ethiopia, Nubia or Kush, and Abyssinia had to be more firmly integrated with the north, no matter how black the pharaohs of the time might be, and also for economic reasons. For the south actually had all Egypt at its mercy. The south was the real source of Egypt's wealth, as it had been of Egypt's civilization. The gold mines were there, and also it was where the vast stone quarrying, copper, and tin mining were carried on. Here, most of the papyrus plants from which the blacks invented paper and built the first and finest boats from the same tough leaves. Here in the south was all the ivory and the only source of the then highly prized ostrich feathers, etc. In short, Egyptian foreign trade depended almost entirely on southern Ethiopia, Added to these economic imperatives, there was an even greater danger felt in the north. This was the control of the Nile, almost all of which, over 3,000 miles, flowed through southern Ethiopia. Black Upper Egypt, being in the middle, was forced by circumstances to play the leading role in the wars for unification in both directions, and considering the many centuries over which they were intermittently waged, they seemed destined to go on forever. It is noteworthy that all these long drawn-out efforts at unification of an empire under a centralized government were confined to the directly indispensable economic regions which were contiguous to each other. Other members of the empire, even those that had long since stopped paying tribute, were not disturbed. In fact, as I have been indicating, Ethiopian empire was often merely a geographical expression insofar as effective rule over all of its supposed parts was concerned. To keep the picture as clear as possible, we have to keep on remembering that at various periods in ancient times, the land of the blacks meant all Ethiopia. All Ethiopia meant all Africa, and all blacks were Africans or Ethiopians or Thebans, etc. There were numerous independent states in the western land of the blacks, Western Sudan, that may have claimed a membership alliance with the Ethiopian Empire as an expression of pride and nothing more, a symbolic gesture to the great state that was the mother of the race and bore the race's name, Ethiopian. Note: it is well known, of course, that Ethiopian is the Greek rendering of black or the sunburnt people. End of quote. In any event, the extent of the territory claimed at times for the empire was so vast that even if there had been efforts to consolidate states other than those directly north and south, it would have been impossible in the absence of administrative and communication systems for the task. The war to bring Nubia under control started near the end of the 11th dynasty, went on for over 400 years, ending in defeat for southern blacks in the next dynasty, 1991 to 1786 BC. This period was notable for the further expansion of foreign trade, especially in Palestine, Syria, and Punt, the golden age of the arts and crafts, a vast program of land reclamation, and marked improvements in irrigation. By repetition, one of the greatest of the great issues stands out. With each and every mass invasion of the whites, the physical characteristics of the Egyptian people changed more and more, became more and more Caucasoid as more and more blacks tended to move southward. When the white dynasties continued for several centuries, as in the case of the children of Israel, Semitic Caucanization was accelerated on an ever-widening scale. One of the significant ethnic changes was that the only people then recognized as Egyptians, the Afro-Asians, became more and more Asian white, both in color, language, and culture. Upper Egypt was becoming less and less Black Egypt. Thebes, under white rule, was becoming a museum center for European and Asian collectors. So by the time Herodotus and other Greek historians arrived, Ethiopia as an empire extended only up to the first cataract. The third period of great rulers. But that time was still far away when Kamose, the last Theban king in the 17th dynasty, 1645 to 1567, opened a full-scale war of liberation against the Hebrews, and the greatest of the dynasties since the fourth had now arrived. This was the remarkable 18th dynasty, with a line of kings and queens who became immortal. Ahmose I, Nefertari, Amenhotep II, Thutmose I, Thutmose II, Queen Hatshepsut the Great, Amenhotep III, Akhenaton the Great Reformer, and Tutankhamun. It was called the New Empire, and so it was in fact. The Hyksos rule was broken, and they were expelled. This, however, could only apply to the rulers and their immediate followers. The Hyksos masses were scattered over the country and permanently settled as Egyptians. They had become integrated into Egyptian society, were contributing to its development on all fronts, and so were not disturbed when their leaders were expelled. There was the usual revival of domestic industry, agriculture, and foreign trade, along with the expansion of imperial rule in Palestine and Syria to the Euphrates and Mesopotamia. This expansion of empire and its promise of great wealth from the accompanying expansion of trade meant renewal of the wars against their black brothers holding the economically indispensable South. So this time, the new and most powerful central government was able to extend its rule farther south than ever, that is, to the fourth cataract, almost to the holy city of Napata itself. For Western writers to state the obvious truth that the black rulers of Egypt did not hesitate to wage wars against the black rulers of southern Ethiopia, to state this would have destroyed their biggest myth. The Egyptians, white Asians or coloreds, were always the conquering heroes over the blacks in the south. In short, as previously stated, these wars did not always follow a racial pattern. As would be expected under black rulers, Thebes was again reorganized under the 18th dynasty and much of its ancient grandeur restored. Temple building in the grand style was resumed. The 18th, like some of the previous African dynasties, was well integrated with loyal Asians. For there were, it should be needless to say, countless thousands of Asians who were wholeheartedly devoted to the blacks, just as there were thousands of Afro-Asians, Egyptians, as loyal to the black race as any black could possibly be. Therefore, when an overall picture is presented, such as in my discussion of the attitudes of Asians, Afro-Asians, and Africans toward each other, one should keep the always big exceptions in mind. Nothing is ever all white, all black, and in this case, all half-white either. In the case of the half-whites, the record overflows with those who, contrary to the rule, hated the fact of their white blood and stuck to the blacks and their cause all the more tenaciously. These are the kinds of outcomes that reflect the complexities and variations of the human mind, and that make generalization about a whole people so ridiculous. The great 18th had begun under the most favorable circumstances, for one of the great black queens of Egypt, Nefertari, and her equally famous husband, Ahmose I, headed the dynasty. As was the custom, she had been named after some of the distinguished queens of the same name who had preceded her. No queen of the same name before her, however, ranked near Nefertari of the 18th in active participation and leadership in national affairs. She helped her son, Amenhotep, in the great work of national reconstruction. If she did not reach the heights of the greatest black queen of Egypt, Hatshepsut, it was because the latter was a queen absolute, ruling alone as a king. To emphasize the point, she often dressed in royal male attire, including the false beard and wig. But the comparison is hardly fair, because each was great in her field of work, and that work was largely predetermined, and the role to be played by each was clear. And that was why, in the end, both Nefertari and Amenhotep I were deified as the founders of one of the world's greatest line of rulers, and some of the finest monuments were erected to their memory. Had the people forgotten Ahmose, her husband, who was the true founder? Queen Hatshepsut, daughter of Thutmose I, was indeed a, quote, man in many of her aggressive and unyielding characteristics as a ruler. As regent for Thutmose III, she tended to be an absolute ruler, and by expertly relying on her feminine charms, she was able to have her own way without a real check by the council, something few African kings could do successfully. But it was not all due to, quote, feminine charms, and perhaps not at all. For Hatshepsut was, in fact, one of the most brilliant minds that ever ascended the throne of a nation. Her reign was in two parts, one as regent and the other as reigning queen in her own right. There was actually no difference, for Thutmose III was too young to count. Even before becoming legal ruler, therefore, she was actively pushing the things dearest to the hearts of all great African leaders: the expansion of foreign trade, international diplomatic relations, perfection of national defenses, vast public building programs, securing the South and the North through either peace or war, and one of her, quote, pet projects, building a great navy for both commerce and war. Her success on most of these fronts made her one of the giants of the race. Meanwhile, the next Thutmose was waiting with increasing impatience and frustration to succeed a woman who, to him at least, seemed destined to live forever. The fact that his wife was the queen's daughter did not affect the really morbid hatred of his royal mother-in-law, unless it was to increase it. Consequently, when he finally became King Thutmose III at last, he himself did what Asians and Europeans were to do on a scale so grand that the history of ancient Egypt as essentially black history was almost completely obliterated. He undertook to erase her name from all the monuments and temples she had built, destroy all documents bearing her name, smash all sculpture likenesses, paintings, and, indeed, anything that might indicate that Hatshepsut ever lived. Also, as later Europeans and Asians were to do to all recognized blacks, Thutmose III had his own name and that of his brother engraved where Hatshepsut's had been chiseled out, thus taking credit for all of her achievements in addition to his own outstanding works. These were many, and need not be detailed, since so much of it repeats the works of great leaders already discussed. Queen Tai was also one of Egypt's remarkable queens. Amenhotep III and Queen Tai gave a son to Egypt who was destined to be one of the greats in the black world. This was Amenhotep IV, known to fame as Akhenaten. He was different than all of his predecessors. He was more preacher than king, and the greatest single spiritual force to appear in the history of the blacks. His great religious reform movement aimed at a greater focus on the one and only Almighty God, creator of the universe. The numerous lesser gods were overshadowing the Almighty by causing the people to be more directly involved with them through the endless number of competing cults and a too self-serving priesthood promoting the cults. Such an unheard of stand by the leader of the nation meant revolution and certain rebellion by the powerful priesthoods all over the land. The new doctrine did not reach the masses, and the non-spiritual demands for leadership on pressing earthly fronts put the king in an unhappy situation. One was the continued Asian harassments on the eastern borders. Akhenaten now became more and more indifferent as his religious movement declined. After 17 years of heroic efforts, he passed in 1362, leaving the reins to Tutankhamun. This stepson's effort to carry on the work of his father had only limited success. The old-time religion still prevailed. Akhenaten's impact on the nation, however, was everlasting. His proposed reforms had more to do with a shift in emphasis than in faith, but even this seems to have been regarded as a direct threat to the powerful priesthood that, no matter how much divided into numerous cults, could unite in a common cause. The power of the priesthood rose as the kings of Egypt became more preoccupied with secular affairs than their religious role as high priest of the Most High. It has been pointed out that the ruler's political influence stemmed not from the constitution, but from his close relationship with the gods. The priests themselves had promoted the evolution of an idea of the ruler's role as chief priest and intermediary with the ancestral dead, and the gods to the idea of the ruler's kinship with the gods, thereby becoming divine himself, the son or daughter of a god, and finally a god himself. As custodians of the temples, the priests were promoting and making their own positions more powerful and secure by promoting the divine kingship idea. It meant that each king would try to outdo his predecessors in building more and more temples, bigger and finer temples, colossal burial structures, the pyramids for the royal saints and the sons and daughters of Amun, Horus, Set, etc. The priests were in the most strategic positions to acquire great economic and political power for themselves, quite naturally and without any particular efforts to do so. They were the first men of learning, scribes, historians, scientists, architects, physicians, artists, mathematicians, astrologers, and especially chemists. Many temples, therefore, were colleges as well as places of worship. The temples were also places through which flowed much of the national revenue. We could go on, indicating how and why priests became so politically powerful in Egyptian life that even a great king like Akhenaten could not overcome their opposition. it was too late for him to escape from the now traditional status of being divine. One might say it was the price a god has to pay for god makers. In 1320 BC, the age of the Ramses began. This time, a line of great leaders was not followed by a line of weaklings. This was the 19th dynasty, 1320 to 1200 BC. And while it did not equal the glorious 18th, the Ramesside kings stamped their periods as one of the most outstanding in the long history of the country. It was only near its end that the usual phenomenon of weakness and decline in the cycle began to set in: general social, economic, and political disorganization. The Ramses rule continued in the 20th dynasty, 1200 to 1085. The 21st, 22nd, and 23rd periods, 1085 to 730 BC, again illustrated, as I stated before, the fallacy of trying to chronicle African history in Egypt by dynasties. I pointed out that at various times during the long struggles for power, we find several different, quote, dynasties ruling at the same time from their respective capitals in various parts of the country. Every period of weak kings at Memphis or Thebes was a general breakdown during which exactly the same thing happened over and over again. The Asian Lower Egypt became independent again, and from its capital at Avaris or Sais pushed the expansion of Asian power in Upper Egypt. By 1085, the Asian population was so vast there that new Asian dynasties were relatively easy to establish almost anywhere north of the First Cataract. During one of these periods, 70 kings in 70 days are reported. The picture now was one of those confused scenes of black dynasties, Asian dynasties, Egyptian dynasties, Afro-Asian, combination dynasties, those formed by alliances between two of the above groups, all ruling simultaneously in Egypt from various capitals. Many historians were further misled by the fact that while some of these so-called dynasties claimed to be the imperial government of all Egypt, others made no such claim and confined themselves to their local chiefdoms or nomarchies. Significantly, many of the latter were headed by priests. Our reference to dynasties formed by alliances between two groups against a third could be misleading to those who failed to grasp what had been said about the changing ethnic character of the dynasties over many centuries. From the 5th and 6th dynasties on, we have pointed out, Asian penetration through the royal marriage route caused the succeeding dynasties, with few exceptions, to be more and more mixed. Often they were only predominantly black, less than half black, or predominantly Asian or Egyptian, Afro-Asian. The founders of the 18th dynasty, like many similar instances, illustrate the reality of the process. For it is well known that the famous queen Nefertari was, quote, all black, while her equally great husband, Ahmose I, was mulatto, Egyptian. So that the 18th, like the great 19th dynasty of the Ramses, was predominantly black, not all black. On the other hand, the long periods of all white Asian and European dynasties were emphasized and had to be emphasized to set the record straight. There were also, for still another example, quote, Libyan dynasties, indicated by the Libyan names of the rulers. But who now were the Libyans? They were, first of all, Western Ethiopians, then heavily Berber, Mongolian, Arab, a sprinkling of Hebrews and other Asiatic peoples, and then, of course, the resulting Afro-Asians. The ethnic composition of Libya was about the same as that of early Egypt, with the exception that there were fewer Europeans and more Mongolians. Libya was once so nearly all black that to be called a Libyan meant black. So the Libyan dynasties during this period could have been predominantly white, black, Afro-Asian, or a combination of all three, depending upon what faction was in the ascendancy at the time. It is also worth noting that not only the whites of Lower Egypt took advantage of every breakdown in the center, Upper Egypt, and declared its independence and tried to extend its rule over the whole land, southern Ethiopia tried to do exactly the same thing. The truth is that the millenniums of contest over Egypt were never really over unification per se, but who should rule the land after unification was completed, the whites of the Delta or the blacks of southern Ethiopia, particularly those south of the first cataract. Indeed, as the Asianization of Upper Egypt increased, migrations of the blacks southward increased, hostility toward the north increased, and the resolve of the blacks to attempt to reconquer all of their land all the way to the Mediterranean was renewed once more. The southern region, therefore, generally became independent as soon as Lower Egypt became independent. It began to threaten Upper Egypt at the same time the Asian threat was spreading. The southern Ethiopians were even more bitter because they had to fight the quote, integrationist blacks of Egypt just as hard as they had to fight the whites from Lower Egypt and Libya. The South was no more prepared to accept the Afro-Asians as rulers than it was to accept all white rule. If anything, they trusted the mixed breeds less because of their ability to play either white or black roles as it suited their purposes. This may also be the reasons so many blacks opposed large-scale amalgamation. It appeared as one of the white man's most effective weapons for the domination of the race, while at the same time slowly removing it from the face of the earth. As proof, the Ethiopians could ask, from whence came our worst enemies? The Egyptians? Are they not half Ethiopian? And do they not now scorn the very Ethiopian name itself, proclaiming themselves to be white? The Ethiopians therefore followed all developments to the north, northeast, and west with closest attention. The activities of the probably Libyan king of the 22nd dynasty, Sheshonq I, did not escape their notice and appraisal. From his capital at Bubastis in Lower Egypt, he pushed affairs on a number of fronts, including the usual strategy of marriage alliances with black ruling families, always with white males. These, after worming their way to power through the African inheritance through female line system, matrilineal, could then change it to the Asian and Western patrilineal system. This invidious scheme for achieving power over the blacks through the blacks did not escape those on the alert. So the move of Sheshonq I in negotiating a marriage with the daughter of a king thereby gaining legitimate control of Thebes. This well-known pattern of expanding Caucasian power, though well-known, never failed to create another stir in the still all-black areas. To make matters worse, from the viewpoint of the blacks, Shoshank had another son made high priest of the African god Amun. The significance of this should be obvious. The whites were systematically preempting the whole of Egypt, even adopting as their own black institutions they could not easily destroy. And they were wise enough to see that to control Africans, they would have to gain control of the African religion. So now, as the whites became priests and worshippers of the supreme god and lesser gods of the blacks in Egypt, the success of erasing every vestige of early African civilization was moving toward the absolute. As the white priesthoods became stronger and more widespread, they were not only able to secure control of Thebes, the most powerful stronghold of the blacks in Egypt, but of equal importance, they were then in a position to gain followers in the rebelling nomarchies and persuade dissident chiefs to acknowledge the overlordship of Asian kings in various parts of the country. In short, they took over Africa's gods as their own, as a means of taking over Africa as their own. There was nothing sudden or new about all this. The process was as long and leisurely as Egyptian history itself, gaining rapid momentum only during the often repeated decades of internal strife. Lower Egypt was always the area from which internal strife in black Upper Egypt was planned and promoted. Secret agents, as mentioned earlier, are not new inventions of modern states, so the only thing new about Tefnakti's penetration of Upper Egypt between 730 and 715 BC was that this time an Asian king, Libyan, from his delta capital, now at Sais, had so inflamed southern Ethiopia that all-out war was declared against both Asians and Egyptians, Afro-Asians, and the 21-year-old king, Pianki, was given supreme command of the black armies. Ethiopia recaptures Egypt. In view of the extent of the expansion of Asian power in Upper Egypt, the Ethiopians' age-old dream of recovering their northern homelands now seemed to be, in very truth, an impossible dream. In 715 BC, the strong situation of the Asians was such that the idea of the blacks repeating Menes' feat of 23 centuries before, that of once again expanding the Ethiopian empire northward to the Mediterranean, now seemed fantastic. Both Asian kings, Tefnakti and Bokoria, were themselves great leaders and field commanders, and of all things they had already taken Thebes and practically had all Egypt under Asian control. Some writers put it the other way and say that they had control of the Thebaid, another name for Upper Egypt. The great city of Heracleopolis alone held until the arrival of Ethiopian forces. The immediate objective of Pianki and the Ethiopian generals was the recapture of Thebes, supported by his naval forces moving down the Nile and the thousands of black fighters who flocked to his standard as he moved northward through Upper Egypt. Pianki's armies drove the Asians out of Thebes, re-established it as the capital city of the north, put Tefnakti and his court to flight, and, apparently using tactics of menace, pressed on to capture the once all-black capital city of Memphis. The rightful rulers of our land have returned. The oppressed blacks cried as they flocked to his standard. Pianki returned to the capital city of Napata in the heartland before Lower Egypt was brought under control again. The task of reuniting the country under Ethiopian rule was left for his great successor, Shabaka. Shabaka firmly established the 25th dynasty, the only one Western writers generally recognize as black. This dynasty, however, should be of special significance for the black world, not because it was African from the beginning, but because the end of this period, 730 to 656 BC, marked the end of all-out efforts by the blacks to retake Egypt. The African victory over the Asians did not lessen the danger from them, for they always had the advantage of striking either from within or from Asia itself. Now the new threat came from Asia. Assyria was fighting its way toward Egypt. The pathways had been made easy because the previous Egyptian conquests of Palestine and Syria had made these countries bastions of defense as long as they were properly governed. The later Egypt had been unable to do this. So Palestine and Syria, like Egypt itself, had become weak from internal disorganization. At first, the Assyrian advance seemed to be concerned only with Syria and Palestine, not Egypt. Uneasiness spread as the Assyrian hosts approached the borders of Egypt. However, Shabaka first followed the pattern of modern diplomacy by loudly professing one thing while actively doing the very opposite. In this case, Shabaka, while actively cultivating the friendship of the Assyrian king Sargon II, was just as active in supporting the armies of the Syrians and Palestinians. Modern, I say, because it was exactly the same kind of commitment and special interest policy that the United States maintains in East Asia and other places around the world. In 671 BC, Esarhaddon led his Assyrian forces to victory near the Egyptian border and moved on to capture the city of Memphis. Memphis, just retaken from one army of Asians, only to be lost to another. Esarhaddon seemed to have thought that he had conquered Egypt when he took the ancient capital. He retired after appointing local princes to collect the usual tribute. Shabaka's nephew, Taharka, promptly marched up from the south again and massacred all of the Assyrian garrisons. Esarhaddon died leading a second expedition of vengeance in 669 BC. His son, Ashurbanipal, assumed the leadership, invaded Egypt, and put Taharka to flight. The Egyptian governors were reinstated under a governor-general named Necho, also Egyptian. As was to be expected, the blacks of Upper Egypt remained loyal to the African line. They shouted loud enough for posterity to hear that the blacks were the, quote, rightful rulers of Egypt. Taharka was succeeded by his nephew, Tanatuman. He renewed the war against the Assyrians and the Egyptians, the latter preferring, as usual, to support the Asians against native Africans. Tanatuman recaptured Memphis again. During which battle the Egyptian Governor-General Necho was slain. This put the Africans in a dominant position in northern Egypt once again. But in 661 BC, the outraged Ashurbanipal drove the African armed forces out of northern Egypt, pursued them up the Nile, and burned the ancient city of Thebes, the stronghold of black power from times immemorial. The Africans, eventually barred from further rule in Egypt, continued Pianki's line, first from the capital at Napata and then at Meroe, where they promoted a broad reconstruction program. There the remarkable 25th dynasty ended in 656 BC. The line of kings from Pianki to Tanatuaman were all buried in the great pyramids they and their ancestors had built at Napata. Let us follow the blacks from Egypt there.